Who's in?
Let's just step up a little bit here. We all want to be in the picture.
Yeah.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah.
I even shaved this morning.
Oh, good.
You ready? Everybody ready? Morning, everybody. Thank you for being here bright and early. I'd like to thank the fire marshals, the fire chiefs, and the advocates for helping with this bill. As you know, there was a fire in a public housing high-rise in my district right before Thanksgiving. 5 people died. My thoughts and prayers are with those families. The building was built in 1970 and did not have sprinklers. So the bill that we are introducing, Representative Noor and I, will require retrofitting of automatic sprinkler systems in certain buildings by 2032. It does allow for extension requests. This bill will save lives. The bill requires owners to submit to the state fire marshal a letter stating their intent to comply and include a plan for achieving the compliance by August 22nd. So they have to do the letter by August 2022 and then do the retrofitting by 2032. So the bill allows the commissioner to adopt rules to implement the bill and to establish a work group to advise the commissioner on rules and extensions. These are critical life safety, maintenance, repairs, and upgrades that are needed to keep the people in public housing and other buildings safe. We don't need anybody else to die. We can do this. Thank you for being here, and I'll pass it on to Representative Noor.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm State Representative Mohamud Noor. I represent District 60B, that is in Minneapolis. It's the home for the City Riverside apartment that my colleague, my Senator Kari Dziedzic just talked about. On that day, we lost 5 individuals. Their names are Nadifo Mahmoud, Jerome Stewart, Taylor Barron, Mary Mahmoud, Amatullah Adam, including firefighter was injured in that fire. Unfortunately, that incident should never have brought us here today talking about legislation. We should never wait for devastation like that for us to act in order to bring change. In fact, former Governor Annie Carlson himself said we made a mistake when he vetoed the 2 bills in 1993, I believe in 94. We owe it to those families. We have to look into ways to save lives. In any given incident of fire, you need 3 things. You need firefighters, you need smoke detectors, and you need sprinklers in order to save lives. The fire that happened in Drake in Minneapolis recently, and many other incidents should never happen in the state of Minnesota. And this is now an opportunity for us to rectify the wrong that we did many, many years ago. So this is a time that we have to stand up for our families to live in a safe and a secure space, and to be able to assure everyone that you are going to have a place in Minnesota, in a home that you will feel safe. For those who we lost, I pass the message of condolences. And for those who are injured, who are still recovering, we pray for you to have a quick recovery. And we have to get things done from moving forward. So we have introduced House File 3003, which we will have a hearing next week on Thursday in public safety around 12:45 p.m. So looking forward to robust conversation to address the automatic sprinklers in all buildings, whether public housing or privately owned. Thank you so much. Alice.
I'm next.
Yep.
I'm Alice Hausman. I chair the House Housing, Finance, and Policy Committee. And I'm here to give a little past history and then to talk about the priority we're setting this year. In past years, general obligation bonding, for which is what we use for public housing, would get, if they were lucky, $2 or $3 million. In a big year, it would be $10 million. And so the result is underinvestment in public housing in a very serious way. This year, the Homes for All agenda asks for $100 million for general obligation bonding for public housing. That's a significant change. It's elevating this issue to say we've ignored it in the past. We cannot do that anymore. One of the reasons why this year we are increasing that amount is the federal government every year withdraws from investments in this. And so it's a time for the state to step up in a more significant way. So the Homes for All agenda includes $100 million for general obligation bonding, and that is, of course, used for public infrastructure, for public housing. It's going to be a high priority for us this year.
I'm Representative Tim Mahoney from 67A. I don't believe this will be coming to my committee, but I'll be championing it in all the committees that I sit on. It's really important. And it's a personal thing for me. When I was a young man, there was a fire in my home. And my younger brother was trapped in the basement. So it's personal when I stop and think that he could have died there. He was very lucky to get out. And then I spent a year working for the St. Paul City Fire Department as an inspector. And I saw instances where every apartment building should have and must be, at some point in time, sprinkled. You have senior citizens that can't move fast and quickly to get out of these buildings. You have young children in some of these buildings that get confused or scared and freeze. We can't afford to let anyone die unnecessarily in a fire. And it's a good use of our state tax dollars because we have these buildings not just in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but throughout the state. And this money will be used there. No one should die unnecessarily in a fire. They are preventable. And sprinklers are the best way to prevent them. And I'll be supporting this bill as wholeheartedly as I possibly can. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hassanan Mohammed. I happen to be one of the relatives and close family member who was lost in that fire incident. Her name was Nadifa Mohamud. And we have a very close family relationship. Matter of fact, I went to school with one of her sons from kindergarten all the way to high school. So this is a personal great loss to my family. We feel it every day. Her loss is felt all around the neighborhood with all the rest of the victims over there. I happened to take also the fire ops training about 2 years ago, so I know what first responders in the fire go through because I wore all those uniforms and stuff. Sprinklers do save lives. This is a time for us to stand up and make sure our elders are really taken care of. This fire so happened to be on our 14th floor, and we still had victims from floors above the 14th who happened to die because of the exhaustion of coming down the stairs. So it's realistic. Some of the victims could not move out so fast. The fire was really coming out seriously, and people in that building do use medication. This happened at the late of, early morning, about 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning. So we have to be realistic, and I suggest we do some urgency on this because our elders do deserve a safe and healthy environment where they live. Everybody in public housing does deserve that as well. It's paramount. We can't put price on life. I've always said this, you cannot go fund life back once it's gone. So I would suggest and I would ask all the legislators to support this, expedite it in committees, expedite it in the processes. We want to make sure everybody gets taken care of in all the public housing and they're safe and sound in their homes. Thank you.
I'm Steve Zachard, retired fire marshal from the city of St. Paul. And just want to talk a moment about high-rise firefighting. They're particularly difficult for firefighters, mostly because they're beyond the reach of the tallest ladders that firefighters have. They have to fight it from inside, and it's also difficult for people to get out from inside. And an apartment building has a stove in every unit, and careless cooking is a leading cause of fire. So there's going to be fires in these high-rise buildings that are beyond the reach of the fire department. It's very labor-intensive, very time-consuming, and very dangerous. The Minneapolis Fire Department did an incredible job getting this ravaging fire out so quickly, considering it was at the 14th floor, which is most fire department ladders can't reach beyond 6 or 7 stories. So high-rise buildings are particularly difficult to fight fires in. And fire sprinklers are the best fire protection you can have. They put water directly on the fire almost immediately, long before the fire department can even arrive. So it only makes sense to sprinkle these high-rise buildings and protect the thousands of people that live in them from the fire and mostly the smoke. So we tried that back in the 1990s. We saw there were mass casualty fires all across the country in high-rise buildings. We saw it coming. We were trying to get ahead of it in the 90s, and the legislature did pass high-rise sprinkler retrofit bill twice, only to be vetoed, as you know. So that hasn't changed, and it's time to do now what we couldn't complete 20-some years ago, 30 years ago. So fire sprinklers are the best fire protection you can have, whether it's in your high-rise or in your home.
Questions? Questions?
Do you want to dedicate some money from the bonds? This could be house. Do you want to dedicate some money from the bonds to help public agencies do these? You talk about 100 million. Are you going to try to carve out some of that as a grant program of some sort?
I know they're looking at that. I know Senator Smith is looking at that on a federal level for if they can carve out, kind of like they did a carve out for lead abatement. So they're looking at that on the federal level. And I've had conversations with Governor Walz's office on possibly doing that with his bonding proposal. And then I think we are discussing a separate bill that would do that in the legislature.
How did you come up with $100 million that for Minneapolis Public Housing Authority alone are estimating $30 million for the costs just for sprinklers alone?
Right, I think that's the whole, so the
The
Senator
100 million
Hausman.
is for the entire state,
Right.
Yeah.
so that's not just. it's
So
not-
for one city, that would be a third of that if it was passed. I guess the overall question is, this is obviously a massive undertaking for.
Right, so in the critical maintenance and critical needs and infrastructure needs across the state public housing is probably closer to $354 million. And then a portion of that would be for life-saving entities and life-saving issues, which could be, if a elevator doesn't work. In Minneapolis is $152 million in critical need backlog, and of that, 30 to 60 million would be sprinklers and related plumbing. So that's how the numbers that I'm looking at. I know from the Homes for All proposal for $100 million. Do you know how they got $100 million? No, I think it's a good round number to start with a discussion.
Are there any plans to provide funding for some of the private owners of buildings? You mentioned the bonding for public housing authorities. Is there anything for the private folks?
Representative Noor and I are discussing that and having, especially with we have a common bond is in our district. We have 2 large public housing, they're not public housing, but 2 large low-income housing buildings there that don't have sprinklers. So we're in conversations with them to see what would need it, and I'll let you answer too.
No, that's exactly right. And for private business owners, there's a tax credit at the federal level, which they should be taking advantage of, up to $1 million, if they're going to do retrofitting sprinklers.
You mentioned in the 90s getting vetoed. We were trying to take care of this a while ago. It seems like a no-brainer, but what do you expect moving forward? Any pushback or any, speed bumps in the road?
Yeah.
Quite frankly, I have not seen anybody say that they're against the bill. I've not received any opposition to this bill. I've been talking about it, and we've been talking about it since last year in December, so I have not seen any resistance, and I'm hoping that we will get it done this time.
I think the devil's in the details. I believe, my understanding in talking to people that were around in the 90s when it was vetoed, is funding became an issue, so that might become an issue, but that's why we're having the conversations to make sure that the public housing bonds are available and can be used for that.
I realize it's a very expensive project, but 2032 is a long way out, almost as far out as the 90s were back for those vetoes. Why wait this long?
I think it is a combination, again, of funding and of planning and of planning, funding, and then just figuring out in this tight labor market how quickly can you do it. Hopefully they can get it done sooner, but I think if we're going to be realistic to get it passed, I think we need to literally give people time to plan.
So, Senator, so it could be a chunk of this 100 million, but you want that 100 million to be for lots of public housing, new construction, for instance. And you talked about maybe a separate bill. Is this maybe some supplemental budget, one-time only money? What might be done funding-wise as separate from the housing bonds?
The housing bond has so the Homes for All has their project. We were looking at and discussing, should it be a one-time appropriation or should it be bonding? Again, looking at the overall picture, 354 million across the state, 152 million deferred maintenance for the city with 30 to 60 for sprinklers. And so could you do a, one-time supplement to get it started? If it's about 1 to 2 million per building for the city of Minneapolis, or do you look at literally putting that specifically as a carve-out and bonding in a separate bill?
Mr. Zackert, I believe that St. Paul has sprinkled all its high-rises. Can you tell us about that project and what the results have been?
Well, the St. Paul Public Housing Agency has retrofit their 16 high-rise buildings. It took them over 20 years, 21, 22 years. And so this project does take a long time, not only to fund, but just the labor to get it all done. But anyway, there were years during that period of time when they couldn't find funding and they weren't doing any work, and then they got funding. They were committed to sprinklering. It was the right thing to do, and they'd had fires, as I explained earlier. Apartment buildings are going to have fires. They had fires that would displace dozens of residents, but in the sprinkled building, oftentimes displaced just the one resident that had the fire. And so there's the tenant displacement, the property loss, but more importantly, the life safety built in when you have fire sprinklers putting the fire out right away. But it took a long time, but they were committed to it. It took over 2 decades to do it, but they got it all done. And just one story, at one of their high-rise buildings, the last one they did, the fire sprinkler inspector approved it, and the very next day they had a stovetop kitchen fire that was put out by one sprinkler head, the day after the fire sprinkler permit was approved. And only that resident had to be displaced and nobody was injured. And that's what fire sprinklers in these buildings can do. And Minneapolis has a lot more, I think 40-something of these high-rise buildings. They have a lot more buildings to get sprinkled.
The legislation had mentioned that a working group could be formed and listed some of groups that could be included in that working group. How did you select those different entities?
So the working group was selected based on what was discussed many, many years ago. And this issue should have been continuously being discussed until we find the solution. But nobody took that initiative. So we decided to include whoever was included in that bill in 1994, 95, I believe. So we are willing to include others who are going to be sitting at the table to make sure that the working group, it's an option for the commissioner to get it done. So I just wanted to welcome the fire marshal. If you wanted to come and say a few statements. You know this issue very well, better than all of us. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Tom Brace. I work part-time for the National Fire Sprinkler Association. I'm the Minnesota coordinator. But more importantly, I was your state fire marshal from 1987 to 2003, which was the period that our representative was just describing, 94, 95, when we tried this issue twice. There's an old expression that says you can't go home again. But that may not be true in this case, and we're delighted, all of us who feel that sprinklers are the ultimate level of fire safety and fire protection, to have a second bite or third bite at this apple. And we really salute the Representative Noor and Senator Dziedzic for their enthusiasm. I was walking over to this morning and I was thinking about who is at risk the most from fire in a general sense? And we, statistically, it says that our children 10 and under and our seniors 60 and over. And where's the single most unsafe occupancy? It's a single family residence. More people die at home. But in close proximity, we've just experienced this tragedy in Minneapolis where 5 people perished, and it could be considerably more had it not been for the skill and the effort of the Minneapolis Fire Department. So I see a bit of an irony, but a pleasant one, that low-income housing will be receiving the focus that is needed for years in this whole high-rise retrofit issue. And the least are going to be protected the best. Clearly, statistically, sprinklers are the ultimate level of fire protection, which over 97% of the time, only one head goes off. Now, I know that some of you moviegoers remember some of these action figures, Schwarzenegger and others, that all of a sudden the whole room is awash with sprinkler heads, one at a time. And I think it's important to recognize that this technology is not something new and earth-shaking. It's been around since the last century. So we're very excited to have the opportunity to work with the fire service, the low-income housing administrators, the legislature, and all other people of good mind and good heart to bring the level of fire safety up in these residences so that we don't experience the tragedy that is ultimately only another fire away. Really appreciate the level of interest that's represented here by the media this morning on this critical life safety issue. Thank you for your attention.
Senator, your news says that up to 40 Minnesota buildings do not have sprinkler systems that were built before '79. Where are they located? Are most of them in Minneapolis, or are they scattered around the state?
There are 26 in Minneapolis that still have to be done, and then I think we're taking inventory, working with Minnesota public housing organizations to figure out where those are located, specifically where there's located. They have the inventory, but I didn't see the exact where they're located.
And just to clarify, that description of 40 Minnesota buildings, is that 40 government-owned buildings, or is that 40 buildings total in Minnesota?
I'm going to have to clarify that with you. Any other questions? Thank you all for being here. Thank you.